So, hi everybody. I am Vedant. Uh, I am an economist by training, but there was a pivotal moment around in 2021 where I got enrolled into the Lamb Fellowship, where you assist a member of parliament with his or her legislative work throughout the year, right? And a lot of at that point of time, my only association was with parliament was there's this festival that happens every 5 years, and elections work phenomenally well, and it's all gaga and yeah, okay. And then there's the parliament. You don't know what happens in the black box called parliament because you're not very privy to what the workings are, the minute details which really matter, right? And when I got into the fellowship, I learned that the parliament is a different ball game, and it though it appears to have lost its relevance in the face of majority governments, especially the Indian Parliament is an institution which needs rework, and the Indian Parliament is much more than what meets the eye. So this talk is entirely on to give you a bird's eye, or rather a very quick synopsis of some of the intricacies of parliament that have really fascinated me. So I will be going to the basics at times as well, but generally is on the intricacies and nuances that have fascinated me. Three key messages for this entire talk, and this is what I would like any of you to take out. One is that the parliament is afflicted by executive dominance in a lot of issues, be it agenda setting, be it on summoning of the parliament, right? And much of it is not by practice, but rather by design. So the executive dominance of parliament, not a new phenomenon, not very prominent in British parliamentary system, but by design in the Indian parliamentary system, there is executive dominance of the parliament. And that's a fundamental, fallacy with the parliamentary system of democracy, as I will go on to explain. Second, parliament does require fundamental reform. And fundamental reform is required because we want the other institutions to work well. Otherwise, what has transpired in 73 years of the Indian Republic is a tussle between the executive and the judiciary. And whenever parliament has lost its voice and relevance, there has tended to be polarizing tendencies. So one corrupts, two divides, three will balance. And it's a famous line from Lord of the Rings. If you the the prequel, the first one or something. And last thing, and engaging with parliamentary committees, and this is the more practical aspect of the entire talk, which is as think tanks, as people who generate ideas, the parliament is a phenomenal institution to get ideas out in the open and to get political acceptance. And a lot of ideas and those minor tweaks, the nuts and bolts that you tighten, actually a lot has happened through parliamentary persuasion. So despite all the constraints that our parliamentary democracy functions under, ultimately there are avenues where we as intellectuals in in society have an ability to influence policy making. The parliament is one brilliant place to do that. So these are the three key messages. The rest of the talk will build upon these three key messages, but then this is what I would like you to leave with at the end of this talk. Like I mentioned, the entire notion of the three branches of the government stems from the separation of powers concept. The Americans codified it into their constitution with clear demarcation of powers. But the parliamentary system is a very funny system wherein the executive is a part of the legislature. So because there is no separation of form, there is no separation of function. And as the code explains, Indian constitutional forefathers and the founding fathers of the Indian constitution somehow recognize that No, parliamentary system is not a brilliant system, and as much as possible, if you go back to the Constituent Assembly debates, a lot of a lot of people have also attempted to bring in elements of the presidential system into the parliamentary system. Of course, they were voted down, but then this understanding that the parliamentary system is flawed fundamentally was always there. Now, the biggest problem with the parliamentary system is you are left hanging between two ends. One is you have an unstable coalition, or you have a brute majority, right? There is no there is no balancing force as such. And in 1985, so because parliamentary governments faced the problem of coalitions where people would keep switching parties, in 1985 they attempted what is called the anti-defection law. And the anti-defection law had the best of intent, but then this is the biggest flaw that constrained the MP's role as a legislator. And the most contentious clause in the 10th schedule is 2(1)(b), which says that a member of the parliament cannot vote against his party line. So that removes all agency of the member of parliament as being a representative of the constituents that elect him, right? And to give you a contrast as to why that single vote of the parliamentarian or a single vote of the legislator matters, I'll just take you back to a video, and this was in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected president, right? And I would like you to watch this video very intently. It's one of my favorite videos showing the power of one vote. So the context is this: it was Donald Trump's first legislative agenda, and the first legislative agenda was to repeal the Obamacare. They didn't want to repeal it in entirety, about 25% thereabouts, 25% of the major provisions. The Republicans had a majority in the Senate. This is the voting in the Senate, right? 52-48. The vice president was a Republican. So even if two Republicans voted against, their party line, the vice president would have the casting vote, and matters would solve. So they needed a third Republican senator to defect. Now, 3 senators had made it clear that we are dicey on how we will vote on this bill. And 2 clearly said, look, we are not going to vote with the Republicans on this. The last person left, and everyone's eyes on that day was on Senator John McCain. He was Obama's opponent during his presidential elections. So this is the moment where John McCain comes to vote into this thing, and it's a beautifully explained video.
1:29 a.m. Senator McCain re-enters the chamber. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell stands at the front of the room like he had most of the night. The grin on his face, though, quickly disappears.
Mr. Peters.
Senator Bernie Sanders appears to nudge Senator Jeanne Shaheen as if to say, watch this. McCain waves his hand to get the attention of the Senate clerk, pauses for just a moment, and gives a dramatic thumbs down. An audible gasp on the Senate floor, and then commotion. Some Democrats can't contain their excitement. Senator Elizabeth Warren leans in to get a better look and breaks into applause. Senator Dianne Feinstein, a single assertive clap. Senator Sherrod Brown slams his hand on the desk in affirmation, while some Republicans, like Senator Marco Rubio, stare in disbelief. Senator Bill Cassidy drops his head. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer turns and waves his arms, apparently trying to quiet them, as Senator John McCain turns around and walks back to his chamber desk all alone.
Mr. Reed.
Yeah. So this video shows the power of the vote of one legislator who is acting on his own independence to actually stall somebody who might have any agenda. So institutions ought to be designed in that particular fashion, where if even if the worst people hem the institutions, nothing can happen to the institutional structures. Unfortunately, the Indian Parliament by design was not designed that way, and some instances to illustrate that are these. Article 85, and there's a paper by very recent chapter in a book rather by Devendra Damle and Shubho Roy on how the agenda setting of the parliament is decided by the executive, that is the president. The president summons when the parliament has to sit. So if there has to be a clear separation of powers between the executive and the legislature, the president cannot be summoning the parliament to sit when they please. What it has transpired or resulted in is that sitting days of the parliament, that parliament actually spends time deliberating on laws, on issues pertinent to the country, has reduced from 121 days pre 1970 to about 68 days post 2000. So they made up for about 60 days a year. The state of legislative assemblies in state are even worse than what the parliament's figures are. So again, Article 98, if there were a clear separation of powers, like we would have envisaged between the judiciary, executive, and the legislature, the Supreme Court and the Parliament Secretary, the presiding officer of the Parliament, that is the Speaker, do not have sort of concurrent powers. One instance, the funds of the Supreme Court, that is the expenditure incurred by the Supreme Court, is charged on the Consolidated Fund of India. That is, the Parliament cannot vote on it when it is charged on the Consolidated Fund of India, whereas the functioning of the Parliament Secretary, the expenditure incurred for that, can be voted upon by the Parliament. Now, doesn't make sense if they were independent or co-equals in a certain manner. Secondly, there have been instances where IAS officers, that are administrative officers of the executive, have gone on to hem positions of the Parliament Secretariat. Again, IAS officers are governed throughout life by the Indian Administrative Service rules or whatever, and then you switch over to another branch. So there is no clear separation of powers that way, and it is sort of by design. If you look at the rules, then you just see sweeping discretionary powers of the Speaker just filled across the rule book. So the Speaker is the final authority and so and so. And finally, one other rule that has clearly stated that the Parliament will just have persuasive and not binding values, Rule 331N, which says whatever recommendations of the committee gives is persuasive, but it is not binding upon the executive. Whereas in the American system, what happens is before any legislation is brought onto the floor of the House, it has to pass a subcommittee check, then a committee check, right? So this is again illustrations of how by design the Parliament has been dominated upon. And once you have it in design, you just need certain instances to just make it a convention. In the initial days of the Parliament, when the first Parliament came into being, the speakers, the Prime Minister and all were very engaged in creating Parliament as a strong institutional body, something akin to the British parliamentary system. But then over time, the 2 years which happened to be very pivotal in Indian parliamentary history is about 1970. And after 1970, there are two things that happen. Limited number of private member bills are discussed. And what are the private member bills? Private member bills are those which are not introduced by a minister, right? Before 1970, 14 private members bills became law. After 1970, I don't know the causal reason, but you had a majority government then, and somehow it became a precedent that whenever a private member bill is discussed, it is withdrawn. The only aberrant from that entire thing was in 2014, and I'll come to that point later on. And the second pivotal year in parliamentary history is at around 1992-1993. Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao was managing a minority government, and then as such, the Parliament was not independent of the executive, but then you started giving the roles of the executive with the parliamentarians. So you instituted something called an MP lads, member of parliament local area development funds, whatever. So a member of parliament gets 5 crore every year into his or her kitty, to spend it on local area functions, which is basically the function of the executive. And essentially what parliament has then been relegated to, and when we vote in elections, is just customer service. Somebody goes and asks parliamentarians, grant me a seat in some school. That's not the parliamentarian's job. So it's his or her job to legislate on matters. But then sadly, the powers have been more convoluted since 1990 to 1993. And around this area, around this time, there was also a lot of tussles between the executive and the judiciary. The judiciary was overarching into the executive's powers, which is it instituted the public interest litigation method of petitioning the Supreme Court at that point of time. So somehow these 2 years tend to be the pivotal years, and then ultimately what we are left with is design becomes precedence, and precedence holds a lot of value in parliamentary tradition, right? The other 2 points are explanatory. I will, for the sake of time, I will not venture into them more. While these are issues of design, the other place where we can actually make a concerted effort is a supply side issue, right? Of parliamentarians being capable to analyze whatever is placed before them. On an average, before the Committee of Subordinate Legislation, in the sessions of the Rajya Sabha from 251 to 255, there were about 530 pieces of rules placed before the Committee of Subordinate Legislation. The Committee of Subordinate Legislation, by mandate, must scrutinize all the rules that are made by the executive and placed on the floor of the House. So, I mean, where do you have the capacity to go to 530 documents? And that is just one House. One other stark difference in framing of laws, I mean, you see that evident when you revisit old parliamentary debates, is on matters of crucial pure technicalities of the law. You would see a richer debate in the earlier days of the parliament. And one thing that you may ascribe it to is the number of lawyers who are parliamentarians. A lot of lawyers become legislators. In the beginning, in the first Lok Sabha, you had about 32% of the, 1/3 of the House having the technical competency to adjudge bills, to comment upon them, and to, give stringent recommendations to the executive. Somehow, over time, that has just depleted. Only 4% of parliamentarians today are lawyer parliamentarians. The second part, where parliament really lacks the capacity to undertake its function, is because parliament does not have a dedicated body like the Congressional Research Service or the Congressional Budget Office, that is in the US legislature, to actually support the Congress or in the Indian case, the Parliament, to analyze bills, to understand issues, to understand what should be done, what ought to be done. And therefore, supply side issues compound the fundamental design issues, and you are left with a weak parliament which has limited powers to do things. Of course, PRS legislative researchers try to fill up the gap, but then 850 versus 35 employees, that's a huge difference. 850, you have domain knowledge experts who actually comment upon briefs, who actually give bipartisan support to the legislators in the US Congress. So that is one fundamental area which we can actually work upon and which requires working upon, as I will go and explain further. So, I mean, all said and done about the problems of the parliament, why should you as a citizen care? And I think it behooves people working in public policy think tanks to even think of this question even a bit harder. Why should you be concerned about the parliament as a citizen, or as an employee in a public policy think tank where you generate ideas? Right? Fundamental question I mean, I frankly couldn't answer it until I, got into the Lamb Fellowship. Was, why do you elect an MP in the first place? I mean, just try asking this simple question to any person who votes in the elections. Why do you elect an MP? I've had this conversation with my relatives, and the general answer you get is, you represent issues of the local constituency in the parliament. So why does he have to go all the way to the parliament to do this? What are the state assemblies for? What are the local councillors for? What are the panchayats for? So why do you elect an MP? One answer that you can that I have convinced myself at the end of the day is, you elect an MP to represent the constituency issues for sure, but when they are deliberating on matters of law, the parliamentarian's fundamental job is to deliberate on matters of lawmaking. And this is where we as electors also have some sort of confusion as to why we are electing an MP. Like I mentioned in the beginning, whenever parliament hasn't been a strong institution of check, there have been numerous tussles. Be it on the appointments issue, the tussles, the Keshavanand Bharati is actually, I mean, it is framed as a tussle between the parliament and the judiciary, but essentially it was not. It was a majority government which amended the constitutional provisions to make amendments, and that is where the court had to step in and say, look, your power to amend the constitution is limited, and we limited it in this manner. You have had numerous instances of judicial overreach, where Supreme Court has interpreted the right to life and liberty as, I mean, also encompassing third generation rights such as right to livelihood, which cannot be effectively delivered with very low state capacity. The other downside of this is, when it comes to issues that matter, for instance, the legalization of same-sex marriage, the one argument in front of Supreme Court was, it is not the Supreme Court's jurisdiction to enter into legalization of same-sex marriage, it's the parliament's jurisdiction to do that. And because the parliament is fundamentally the executive, you cannot be relying on the executive all the time. By the way, there have been private member bills which have sought to legalize same-sex marriage and also, decriminalize, that was before the Supreme Court judgment, decriminalize same-sex marriage, and they were just stopped on the floor of the House. So unless you have parliament actually representing the voice of the people, and parliamentarians having the judgment to do that, you cannot have parliament as an effective institution. One final point, the penultimate point in this, it's my pet peeve, and it's the appointments clause. Appointments are crucial for independence of institutions, and I had sort of mulled over how do you make appointments to the judiciary. I will just digress on this point for 2 minutes, but then a big question impending before our institutional governance structure is, how do we appoint judges? Because in no democracy, no republic in the world do judges appoint themselves. Of course, yeah, that is a problem. But then that problem stemmed from the executive wanting to have a pliant judiciary. There were precedents where 3 judges were superseded to make one chief justice, one judge, the pliant judge, the chief justice. So the appointments clause in the American Constitution is dealt beautifully, and it arises from a fundamental moral problem, which is, say we have a cake on the table, and if I were to divide that cake between 2 people such that both are satisfied with the shares that they receive, but nobody has the incentive to divide it unequally or unfairly. So you have a cake, you need to divide it between 2 people such that both are satisfied with the shares that they receive and nobody has an incentive to divide it unfairly. And it is a age-old puzzle posed before King Solomon, and the solution is very simple. One person gets to choose to cut the cake whichever way they want, but the other person gets to choose the slice first. So based on this simple intuition, maybe we could design an appointments clause in Indian Constitution or in Indian institutional governance where For the judiciary, the judges have the plenary powers to nominate, but a joint committee of the parliament has plenary powers to reject the nomination. It should not be the executive doing the rejection. Currently, it's just the Supreme Court collegium and the executive which does that. So I'll definitely share the article, that the draft article that we have written on this for your consideration later on. But this is one pet peeve of mine. So for effective functioning of the other institutions, your independent institutions, you need to have a strong parliament. And therefore, what are the avenues through which you can, as a public policy think tank, more importantly, get a lot of ideas on the table, or rather persuade the parliament in a particular manner, or get ideas into political acceptance. And I think the best place to do that is a parliament, because in my interactions with a number of MPs, they have been very receptive to ideas. They entertain new ideas. In committee meetings, they deliberate on a lot of these ideas, and somehow it creates the space for political acceptability of far-fetched ideas. So that is what I mean by expanding the Overton window, the window of acceptability of ideas in a society. Second, the executive tends to be more persuaded by a parliamentarian than by some random person sitting somewhere going and telling them, look, this is what you should do. But if a parliamentarian tells them, maybe you could consider this. And most of this happens through back channel persuasion, through letters, through interventions in the parliament such as 0 hours and special mentions and things like that, where the parliamentarians become the broker of ideas, where the parliamentarians can effectively persuade the executive and also get your idea on board. One interesting statistic that I was going through is there is this notion in parliamentary, in parliamentary practice, that the government, that is a minister, gives assurance on the floor of the house. So it usually happens during the question hour, where the MP poses a question pertaining to maybe their constituency or maybe a particular policy, and the minister usually replies saying that I will look into this matter and I assure the honorable member that this matter will be resolved. And there is a parliamentary committee which tracks all this government assurances given and whether those assurances have been fulfilled. If you see the data from 1956 to 2021 of all the assurances that were given on the House of, and these are very informal verbal assurances given, but they are followed up. So whenever I have tried to persuade MPs to get something done, I would say, do it through a government assurance, solicit an assurance from the minister. That is, you have to work in this constant optimization. And final point, and I shall go, this will go on to the last slide, which is how, as public policy think tanks, could we support the parliament or get ideas, get political acceptance of ideas. And that the committee system, for all its flaws, works wonderfully well currently. A lot of new ideas come in through the committee system. A lot of recommendations are taken by the government, and bureaucrats also give you ways how to work around the government system when a recommendation comes from the committee. So I really like this line by Nitin Pai, which he wrote in one of his articles. The more you sweat in the parliament, the less you bleed on streets. And the comparison between GST and farm laws, Ajay has also done an episode on farm laws, was purely how do you persuade everybody to get on board with you. In GST, it was a rigorous process where you had to constantly talk with finance ministers of state, always have the opposition listening to you listening to them, and it was a consultative process which sort of brought about, for all its fallacies, it got a fundamental reform such as GST on board. Same thing goes with the IBC. Most of the recommendations of the committee were just taken prima facie. The farm laws, on contrast, they were just rammed through parliament in uh, in circumstances where parliament was not, effectively functioning, and you just rammed it through the parliament, you didn't get anything. Deliberative policy making, that is where you can really influence, or rather get your ideas on board. Like I mentioned, most of the recommendations of the committee are accepted. Same goes with the committee on subordinate legislation. Now the last 2 points are, last second point governs, it's the rule that says that committees can solicit expert opinions, and any experts can, go and tender their advice or their suggestions to the parliamentary committee, and that's a beautiful avenue to get a lot of things ongoing, or to at least get political discourse started on it. Finally, I was not aware of this until the member of parliament I worked with became the chairman of the committee on petitions. So I don't know how many people are aware of this, but do you know that you can petition the parliament? So any individual, any organization, be it on any matter, if they have a grievance, they can petition the parliament. The parliament will examine, and the parliament will give its recommendations. The committee on petitions will do that. It will give its recommendations to the executive, and most of that are followed through. Or else, if assurances are given, they follow through. The committee tracks them. So, with these words, with these avenues for hope and change, I'd like to conclude the presentation, and I'd like to open the house for discussion and any questions from anyone.